The Oscars are coming up soon. 2 years ago, we discussed the Best Picture winners of the 1920s. Last year, we went over all the winners of the 1930s. And so now, join me in 2025 for our two-part series, Best Picture winners of the early 40s and Best Picture winners of the later 40s. Please comment some of your favorite Best Picture winners below, and let's take a look at 1940 through 1944. Last night, I dreamed I went to Mandalay again. So begins our Best Picture of 1940, the only Best Picture directed by none other than Alfred Hitchcock. Rebecca is not one of the Hitchcock films that people would name immediately off the top of their head, like Psycho or Rear Window or Vertigo. But it is a very interesting film, and a good work by Hitchcock as well. Hitchcock, of course, had adapted it from Daphne du Maurier's novel of the same name. The story of a young woman who marries an older man whose last wife, Rebecca, who was the perfect wife, died, leaving him miserable, and she inherits this massive country estate where she is to be the new mistress, but nobody thinks she could ever replace Rebecca. And as she digs deeper, she begins to find there are many skeletons in Rebecca's closet. So Rebecca is a kind of moody Gothic story, not the only Daphne du Maurier adaptation Hitchcock ever did either. The Birds is based on one of du Maurier's stories, and Hitchcock had adapted Jamaica Inn as his final film in England before moving to the US. Jamaica Inn, often regarded as one of his worst films, if not his worst. However, if you can find the restored version, and if you like swashbucklers, I think you'll enjoy this one. But nonetheless, back to Rebecca. Rebecca has a very strong cast, the most effective of which would be Judith Anderson in an Oscar-nominated role as the mysterious housekeeper, Mrs. Danvers. You can see her there on the back of the box, menacing Joan Fontaine. There are a few big changes to the story. They don't deviate so much that I would say it's not a faithful adaptation, but they do add kind of a different context. One is, of course, the death of Rebecca, which is given sort of a different cause and different circumstances in the movie. It's the same general idea, it's just kind of simplified and made a little cleaner. And the other being the character of Mrs. Danvers, who is de-aged from the book, where she's a much older woman, to Judith Anderson's role there on the back. And this, of course, has attracted discussion from many fans. Indeed, there's a whole segment of the documentary, The Celluloid Closet, exploring exactly what the relationship between the late Rebecca and Mrs. Danvers might have been, as it didn't seem to be one, shall we say, between a mistress of the house and her chief servant. Nonetheless, though, Rebecca is a beautifully made and beautifully photographed film. Hitchcock does a nice job with kind of the overbearing nature of this giant estate that our young hero, or heroine I should say, who is never named by the way, finds herself thrust into there, and Laurence Olivier as her brooding husband, no doubt taking a few pages from his role as Heathcliff in Wuthering Heights not too long before. Great cast in the supporting roles as well. George Sanders, C. Aubrey Smith. Lots of people turn up there. So Rebecca is a pretty solid watch. It is a little slow. It's a very long film, and it definitely feels it. But many of Hitchcock's films are very methodically paced, that sort of thing. And Hitchcock himself even toyed with this in some of his movies like Strangers on a Train, where he plays around with pacing quite a bit. So Rebecca being slow-paced isn't necessarily a bad thing. It might not be sort of the top-tier Hitchcock thriller we're all expecting, but if you're looking for a very deep, very moving, and kind of overbearing and scary romance story, Rebecca's probably the place to go. I could see why it would resonate with audiences back in the 40s, and I think it's still pretty darn effective today. When it comes to movies of 1941, the one everybody immediately thinks of, "I'll put you in Sing Sing Geddes!" Citizen Kane It's terrific, as the posters boast, and indeed Citizen Kane is an amazing film, one that everybody should see, and even if you're not into the technical aspects of the film, the cinematography and the moody lighting, things like that, the story works too. A man who has everything, all the money, all the power he could ever want, and he's never happy, and he's just a crappy human being. But Citizen Kane did not win the Best Picture of 1941, nor did many other favorites such as The Maltese Falcon, Sergeant York. Alfred Hitchcock was not able to follow up with another Best Picture winner because Suspicion didn't win. Instead, the winner was directed by John Ford. We talked about John Ford. When I talked St. Patrick's Day movies, we discussed The Informer, which won him his first Best Directing Oscar. And we talked about several of his westerns on this channel too, so it makes sense for a man who's directed movies about Ireland and the American West, he would also find time to make a film about Wales. In our Best Picture of 1941, How Green Was My Valley, a beautiful story about a Welsh coal mining family and their various struggles, led by young Roddy McDowall as Hugh, young boy growing up, seeing his father and older brothers go off to work in the mine and the various issues that happen, meeting his older brother's wives and things like that, and the beautiful Enharad, played by Maureen O'Hara, his sister, who gets into all sorts of misadventures there. You see her on the cover. Indeed, she's almost kicked out of the church at one point, but she doesn't actually deserve it. This is kind of a slice of life story. If you're expecting a huge epic, it's not really the case, but it works really well, and John Ford was definitely the man to direct it. Today, How Green Was My Valley is hated, mostly because it's not Citizen Kane or The Maltese Falcon or whatever 1941 film is your favorite, but I don't think that's really fair. How Green Was My Valley is beautifully photographed. It was supposed to be made in color, instead it was in black and white, but honestly that doesn't really affect the quality of the film at all. Ford's direction is very strong, and the cast helps to really define it, I think. You see there Walter Pidgeon, we'll come back to him later in this video, as Mr. Griffith, who takes himself on as Hugh's mentor, helping him through school and various other episodes of his life, that sort of thing. Donald Crisp, who popped up in more movies than I could probably name off the top of my head. He appears, and indeed won a Best Supporting Actor Oscar for his role as Mr. Morgan, the patriarch of the family, the man whose life revolves around working in the mine, then taking care of his wife and kids. Sarah Allgood, who I talked about when I discussed the worst of Alfred Hitchcock, I said she was the only real beacon of light in his adaptation of Juno and the Paycock. She is amazing here as Hugh's mom, one of those feisty women, stands behind her man, stands for her family, doesn't take anything from anybody. It's a beautiful story, a very simple one, but I can see why audiences of the early 40s kind of wanted that idyllic, countryside view and that sort of thing. And it does comment on various social issues of the day too, involving child labor and things like that, how management treats workers and that sort of thing is all addressed here too. But I've never read the novel by Richard Llewellyn that it's based on. Someday I'll have to do that. But How Green Was My Valley stands as a very effective and a very touching movie, and I would say a strong choice for Best Picture of 1941. Yeah, it's not quite one of those instant classics like Citizen Kane, but if you haven't checked it out, I give it a hearty recommendation. How Green Was My Valley tends to be one of the least liked and least respected Best Picture winners, and that carries over into our winner for 1942, a movie I only have in DVD and Blu-ray collections, Mrs. Miniver. Walter Pidgeon returns for this one, this time paired with Greer Garson. They'd also worked together in other movies like the very underrated Mrs. Parkington. But Mrs. Miniver is the story of a middle-class British family suddenly faced with the realities of World War II. Being bombed by the Germans, having their children go off to war, get involved in war-related functions, and the difficulties that ensue. Mrs. Miniver was made predominantly as a propaganda piece, to boost morale, to show the British would never give up, they keep going, literally, keep calm and carry on. And that's probably what the movie's most remembered for. Here's the booklet from one of those big Warner Brothers Blu-ray sets, noting how Winston Churchill praised the movie for boosting morale, noting how it's, a product of its time, really. But Mrs. Miniver is still a very effective movie, mostly for the performances. Greer Garson very rightfully won her Oscar as the matriarch of the family. She has some amazing scenes, including one where she has to deal with a crash-landed German soldier prowling around her house and garden, that sort of thing. Teresa Wright won her Oscar as well for her role as kind of a young neighbor. And there's many good supporting roles too from great character actors and actresses like Dame May Whitty, and of course the wonderful Reginald Owen as Mr. Foley, the shopkeeper. He gets most of the wacky hijink, kind of stuff, the 1940s screwballness. But Mrs. Miniver works pretty well still, I would say. In the regards, it's just a very solid movie. Again, a product of its time, but showing that movies could be used for a grander purpose. My grandmother always liked this movie quite a bit, and I can't say I blame her, because if you can look past some of that dated stuff, it's actually a really effective film. And it was directed by the great William Wyler, who directed it with just a nice soft touch, and yeah, the ending's kind of overblown, but I think the rest of it makes up for that pretty well. I found it a bit difficult to talk about Mrs. Miniver as it's so rooted in World War II, and looking at it from an outside perspective makes it kind of difficult to discuss. Another film that's going to be hard to talk about, a kiss is still a kiss, a sigh is still a sigh, the fundamental things apply as time goes by. Casablanca. This one's a classic through and through, one of the most quotable films ever made. There is nothing I can say about Casablanca that hasn't been said 1,000 times already. As you can see, I have many home video releases of it. Here's the VHS with the little commemorative booklet, which is pretty cool. I have the much disliked colorized release, which is interesting to watch. I don't think it hurts the film that much because it is Casablanca. It loses, I think, some of the depth of each shot, but I wouldn't say it was unwatchable. And I have one of the nicer DVD sets there, but there's really not much I can say about Casablanca that, again, hasn't been said already. It has an amazing cast. I feel like I've said that for every movie so far, but these are Best Picture winners, and actors are often one of the chief ways that we judge a movie. But here, Humphrey Bogart and Ingrid Bergman, in perhaps the greatest screen couple ever. Will they stay together, or will war tear them apart? The mystery that lasts the whole film. And a great bevy of character actors in supporting roles. Conrad Veidt, we talked about him a lot last Halloween, pops up as our Nazi villain. Even though it takes place during World War II, Casablanca can kind of be enjoyed outside of that context as well. It could have been made earlier or later, with a different conflict put in place, and it really wouldn't have mattered that much, at least not in my eyes. That sort of thing. Unlike Mrs. Miniver, which is very much a product of its time. Casablanca has more of a timelessness to it, I would say. We also have, of course, Claude Rains as the wisecracking police captain. Sidney Greenstreet, the fat man from the Maltese Falcon, pops up too as one of Humphrey Bogart, aka Rick's main competitors. Casablanca is a beautiful film, but also a very funny movie. I was lucky enough to see it on the big screen a few years ago, and I'd forgotten how many gags and jokes and stuff there were, and the audience was in stitches at a few points, laughing about some of the stuff. And you wouldn't think of it as a comedy right away, but it's such a witty film. Humphrey Bogart's line, "Are my eyes really brown?" after reading the dossier the Nazis have prepared on him, that sort of thing. At its core, it's a love story, secondarily a war story, but third of all, it's just kind of like these people's lives. Casablanca attracting many different people from all different backgrounds, trying to escape one thing or another. Somehow they all end up colliding at Rick's Cafe American, that sort of thing. Of course, as time goes by, becoming an iconic song. Jimmy Durante did an amazing cover of it, not for this film, but much later. And of course, it is one of the most quotable films ever made. Here's Looking at You, Kid, among other things. Louis, This is the Beginning of a Beautiful Friendship, being another. But if you haven't seen Casablanca, you owe it to yourself to see it. It might take one or two views if you're not too familiar with the time period or with the work of the actors, to really sink in. But Casablanca feels very modern, just because of the script, which deals with a lot of different dynamics, a lot of different characters, but weaves them all together really, really well. It doesn't feel like a film made in the early 40s in my eyes, and was certainly a worthy choice for Best Picture of 1943. And coming to the end for today, I hate to end on a bum note, but we have to wrap it up with my least favorite Best Picture winner of the early 40s. Would you like to swing on a star? Carry moonbeams home in a jar? Then just watch Going My Way, Best Picture of 1944. I've reviewed this one before, way back when I first started my channel, and I said it was so saccharine it might make your teeth rot. And I hold by that. Going My Way, the story of Father O'Malley, played by Bing Crosby, who helps mentor the wayward youth and helps the elderly priest, played in a very fun role by Barry Fitzgerald, kind of realize it's time for him to retire and move on, that kind of thing. And does all these good deeds and everybody loves him. And indeed it gave Bing Crosby his Oscar for Best Actor, which he quite rightfully earned. He's one of the reasons to watch the film. It has some great musical moments in it too. But overall, Going My Way is just way too sappy and way too sweet for me. And it doesn't feel realistic at all. Now granted, coming off several years of bloody combat in World War II, I realized this movie would indeed resonate with World War II era, 1944, filmgoers. They absolutely wanted some light, fun escapism. I totally get that. Not a film like Mrs. Miniver or Casablanca that would remind them of the war, going for more like something like How Green Was My Valley, that would say, hey, we can still focus on happiness and love and that kind of thing. But Going My Way has just aged so badly. The last time I watched it, I couldn't help but think of another Best Picture that addressed priests, Spotlight. Now granted, Bing Crosby does not come off as a predator, but it's like, I don't know. I mean, him chasing all these boys around and rounding them up for a choir and all that stuff just doesn't feel particularly realistic and is a little bit uncomfortable to watch today. It's worth watching for the music, and again, it does have some good supporting performances in it. Porter Hall pops up briefly as a grumpy atheist. Of course, Barry Fitzgerald in an Oscar-winning role as elderly priest there, who Father O'Malley will be replacing. And there are a few other fun little cameos here and there. Alfalfa from Our Gang, or the Little Rascals, for example, as a teenager pops up. But for the most part, I think Going My Way is pretty skippable, unless you're maybe a big fan of Bing, that kind of thing. But other than that, I don't know, it doesn't do much for me. It never has. And one that I would say is a bit of a letdown. I get why people like it though, and the Swinging on a Star song is really fun, but I'd say skip this one.